Well, I'm back in the hot tub, talking with conservatives and decoding their conservative thoughts. Now, some people aren't conservative, but they suffer from conservative thoughts or conservative beliefs. This next story, let's call him Everett. He is a conservative, the kind of guy that has a tiny little Bible in his pocket and a tiny little Constitution right next to it. He thinks the Constitution is essentially another book of the Bible. He also thinks it provides us with human rights, and that if we didn't have the Constitution, then we wouldn't have human rights. Apparently, he doesn't understand what the word unalienable means. Now, as a constitutionalist, or whatever you call folks that think the Constitution is some sort of magic document, he had a wide variety of beliefs. And because he's conservative, and many of his beliefs are based on not just the Constitution, but the Bible, I heard some just bizarre things come out of Everett's mouth. Now, we're sitting there in the bubbles, and I'm trying to get my relaxation and my massage therapy on. I like to actually use the hot tub for the jets. I don't just sit there. I use the jets to massage my achy old muscles. I'm an old man now, and I have achy muscles. It's miserable. Well, it's not miserable, but it's terrible. And Everett starts telling me how he hits his children so that he doesn't have to hit his children. He actually said that. I paused and I said, "What? What? Sorry? What did you say, Everett?" And he said, "Yeah, so I hit my children, and that's so that I don't have to hit my children. You see, you start them early, you hit them when they're young, and then they learn really quickly, and then you don't have to hit them later when they get older. And therefore, you don't have to hit them very hard." He was very proud of that. He was very proud that he hits them when they're very young, and he doesn't hit them very hard, but that's so he doesn't have to really belt them when they get older. I said, "Everett, can't you figure out another way to deal with your children other than hitting them?" And he said, "Well, it works." And I said, "Well, that might be, but I'm not convinced that it does work. The science doesn't demonstrate that that works. But even if it does work, like let's just assume it does work, haven't you developed your brain enough to actually get past violence? Like, what are you, some sort of cretin?" And he didn't like that. Now, Everett and I have this kind of relationship where we can actually say mean things to each other, and it doesn't really faze us. It's kind of like snarky on purpose. I think Everett actually kind of likes it. Like, he thinks it's like being part of the boys. It's like locker room talk to him. He thinks it's kind of fun to be a little bit mean and cruel to each other. So after I called him a cretin, he didn't like it, but it's not like don't get me wrong. I wasn't insulting him in the way that you might think. And he said, "Well, what would you do?" And I said, "Well, I don't have children, so I'm at a disadvantage in this conversation, and I'm largely speaking from a place of ignorance." But I said, "Everett, can we agree that children are helpless, especially in relation to their parents? Like, your 3-year-old daughter poses absolutely no threat to you, right?" And he goes, "Well, yeah, of course not." And I say, "So, Everett, can you really justify violence against a completely helpless individual?" And he thought about it for a second, and he said, "Well, I mean, if it's to teach her a lesson." And I said, "But can't you engage your brain to a degree above violence? Like, okay, violence works, let's say, but can you come up with some other solution that doesn't include violence? I mean, can't we just agree that violence shouldn't be carried out to the most helpless members of our society? It shouldn't be done against anybody. Nobody should be committing violent acts towards anybody, but especially, at the very least, can't we at least come to some consensus that the most vulnerable of us shouldn't be reprimanded with violence? I mean, she's your daughter. She's 3 years old. Do you really mean to tell me that you can't come up with something other than hitting her?" Now, we didn't get into how hard he hits her, or if he uses a belt, or what he does, or if it's spanking, or whatever. And he wanted to make it sound like he didn't hit her very much, but the Adrian Peterson child abuse case came up. And Adrian Peterson, for those of you that don't know, is a football player, or he was a football player. I don't think he plays anymore. In fact, I'm almost positive he doesn't. But he was a very good football player, and he very severely beat his children, and like with rods on their genitals. And he just didn't seem to care at all. And Everett brought this up. He said, "Well, Adrian Peterson did it." And while he said, "I don't agree with the way he did it," he said it worked. And I mean, who are we to say that parents can't discipline their kids in the way they see fit? Now, he very clearly gets this notion from the Bible. I didn't bring this up, though. I mean, he literally has a Bible in his pocket. Not in the hot tub, but I've seen him take it out of his pocket to put it in his locker so that it's not in a place, so that it's right there. And it's he literally has the Constitution there too. So it's just a cocktail of weird ideas coming out of Everett. And in response to this Adrian Peterson thing, I kind of threw my hands up in the air and said, look, Everett, if you're seriously going to sit there and try to justify the kind of child abuse that Adrian Peterson committed against his own children as an example of why I should reconsider my position on nonviolence, I said, I think we're just going to have to move on. We're going to have to change topics. And I think he saw the level of disgust in my face, and he was like, okay. And then he wanted to talk about the Constitution. Now, I love these constitutionalists. They just can't shut up about the Constitution. The Constitution, the Constitution. The best fucking thing ever written, right? And he was talking about how wonderful of a document this was. And he was talking about how smart and ingenious the people were who wrote it. And I said, Everett, are you familiar with the 3/5 compromise? I think it's 3/5. Whatever, are you familiar with the compromise? And he said, yes. And I said, you mean to tell me that you think that the smartest men that ever lived wrote the best document ever created for a government, and they included mathematics to try to tell us. They sat in a room and actually put time and energy into figuring out that African-American men were only 3/5 of a person, and they didn't even consider women. Like, they didn't even, it was just understood that women were not included in any of these rights that they were writing down in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and all the founding documents. And I said, and you mean to tell me that these men who obviously didn't know anything about Darwinian evolution and didn't know, they were completely ignorant of modern science, were able to write one of the smartest documents of all time? I said, that's just asinine. I said, not only is the 3/5 compromise demonstration that they were stupid, but they were really adamant about their stupidity because they took so much time and energy in determining who isn't included in this document, as opposed to recognizing that we're all Homo sapiens. And by the way, the founding fathers didn't know about Darwinian evolution, and they didn't know about modern cladistics, which is our modern way of classifying life on Earth, but they did know about Linnaean taxonomy, which was the more ancient way of classifying living creatures. They knew the words Homo sapiens. They knew that all people were Homo sapiens. Now, back in those days, it was not as clear. They didn't have hard sciences. They didn't have genetics, for instance, to determine these things. And they certainly didn't have adequate morphology or cladistics, as I just explained. But they didn't err on the side of humanity. Instead of saying this document is for everybody, they took a lot of extra time to exclude people. And again, they didn't even consider women people at all. Now, that brings me to another notion of conservative that Everett definitely believes, and that's this women as chattel movement. We see this in trad wives. We see this largely from Jewish and Christian communities and organizations that want to revert back to a more biblical worldview. And what that means is that women aren't people. In the Bible, it's very clear that women are not people. They're chattel. They're a commodity. Men are people, and they're made in the image of God, and women are something else, made specifically to be man's companion, meant to be completely subservient. Now, Everett believes this. It's sad that he's raising daughters, but Everett believes in this. And he also believes that the Constitution is a brilliant document, despite the fact that it demonstrates to us when we read it that it's not. And by the way, there's nowhere in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights or any of the amendments or any of the documents that says we got it wrong, all these people are actually people, they're all Homo sapiens. It just says we can't have slaves. It doesn't correct the math of African American men. And right after it says we can't have slaves, it provides a caveat for the time when we can have slaves. So it talks about prisoners. So again, the document is terribly flawed. Should we, as modern citizens of the United States, Homo sapiens, scientific thinkers, progressives, and humanists, rewrite the Constitution? Yes, I think we should. I think it should include definitions like who it's for, Homo sapiens, scientific terminology, definitions of what Homo sapiens is using science, cladistics, morphology, genetics, and so on. And I think it should have obvious tests that we can conduct to determine who of us are Homo sapiens if that's ever called into question, which it always is, which is why Roe v. Wade was overturned, which is why so many laws are so racist and so bigoted and so sexist, because people dehumanize other groups of people, and the Constitution isn't forthright about who the document's for. So in the law, in the eyes of the law, you can be discriminated against, and people are, and you can have your rights taken away from you, and people are, and there isn't any clear test, and there isn't any call for it, because the document is unscientific. It's flawed. Now, the reason I brought up women as chattel is because nowhere in those documents does it say that women are included in these rights. It doesn't even clearly say what rights we have or how we know we have rights, that we can demonstrate them scientifically. So, for instance, our right to bodily autonomy is something that we can demonstrate using the many different sciences at our disposal. But specifically, we can derive it directly from the biological definition of life. It doesn't say that in any of the founding documents, and it doesn't say women are included. So this movement towards women as chattel, I don't see how we're going to fight it. The indoctrinated religious fundamentalists and the religious moderates, who are also just as indoctrinated, just not quite as cruel as a fundamentalist, there's nothing in their documents, there's nothing in their religious documents or in our founding documents to stop the women as chattel movement, the trad wife movement, the movement towards traditional values, towards female subservience, and so on. And Everett, in his infinite wisdom, in between bouts of beating his daughter and reading the Constitution and not understanding what unalienable means, is going to fall right into that category. I just saw him again the other day, and he was talking about his wife and how he wanted her to be more subservient. She's already like a really hardcore Christian wife, so she's already doing pretty much everything he says without question. At least that's how he describes her. I have never been with them as a couple, but he describes her as incredibly subservient, and he wants her to be more subservient. He was lamenting that she left the house with a friend of hers. So ladies, chivalry's not dead. It's alive and well, and the reason why you're not allowed to open doors is because you're not allowed to go through them unless I open it for you as a man, right? I think that's one of the funny misconceptions about chivalry, is all of this pageantry and all of these gestures are largely due to the fact that women aren't even supposed to really touch the ground. They are to be in horizontal positioning and ready for penetration at all times, according to men, especially men that view women as chattel. And this idea that we open doors for you and buy things for you and do things for you is a vestige of this former notion that you weren't even a person and that we own you. You don't open a door because I'm not ready to go through it yet. And you go through it in front of me so I can watch you. And if you do anything stupid, I'm probably going to put my hand around your neck and push you into wherever I want you to go. That's what chivalry comes from. That's why it's so controlling. That's why it's so infantilizing. You're not even allowed to open your own doors. You're not allowed to do anything you're not directly, specifically told to do. You're not going to go anywhere unless I show you where it is I want you to go. That's what this women as chattel movement is all about. That's what the trad wife movement is all about. And that's what Everett is sadly proposing in a hot tub at my athletic club. You can't write this stuff. So to bring it back around full circle, and this is the kind of, if this sounds erratic to you, if my telling of this anecdote sounds weird to you, it's because this is sort of how Everett speaks. Like I'm sitting here thinking, how did this all come out of his mouth? And largely, I didn't talk that much because there's not really a lot of point in talking to Everett. I just listen to him and then I insult him because he thinks it's funny or whatever. But if this sounds weird and erratic, it's because that's how Everett talks. I mean, he's one of these conservatives that just jumps from topic to topic to topic. It's called a Gish Gallop when you're doing it in a debate format, but this is often how weird, scattered thinkers communicate. We're talking about child abuse and why I hit okay, now we're talking about the Constitution, and I don't understand the word unalienable, and he didn't say that, but I assessed that based on what he did say. And then we jump to women as chattel and the trad wife movement, and we jump all over the place. Talking to Everett is like talking to a schizophrenic who's having a psychotic episode. It's just a whirlwind of what the fuck. I have no idea what's next. In my estimation, just that experience alone is fairly conservative. I know a lot of conservatives that talk that way, especially the ones that are just poorly, just terribly inarticulate, but then also the ones that get sucked into this conspiracy theory Alex Jones nonsense. I mean, they can't stay on topic at all. Anyway, I'm starting to sound like one because I can't stay on topic. So what's the punchline here? The punchline is that the two movements, this pro pro-America, pro-Constitution / pro-traditional values is kind of one and the same. And as a progressive humanist, you should be very skeptical of, I'm going to call them constitutionalists. I don't know what they're called, but you should be very skeptical of those folks, and you should be skeptical of the Constitution itself. It's not a very well-written document. It doesn't guarantee your rights. It doesn't even describe what your rights are. What it gets right, it largely gets right on accident, and most of what it gets right is being eroded away by the traditional values group, who would, out of one side of their mouth, say that the Constitution is maybe more than just a normal document. It might be otherworldly, but then out of the other side of their mouth would take away your right to journalism and to free speech and so on. And that same movement, that same let's get back to traditional values movement, is now dehumanizing women to the point of not even being human beings anymore. They're trying to revert back so far into the past. A lot of the times the aesthetic is the 1950s, but the sentiment, the ideas, the ideology is biblical. Those two movements are largely one and the same. And as a secular humanist, a skeptic, and an ultra-progressive, you need to be aware of that and identify that those are the same people, and that's the same message. Dehumanizing women, traditional values, those are the same thing. If you're a constitutionalist, you have no resources in that document to tell you that African American men are human beings. In fact, you have the opposite. You have a fraction that was given to you by these founding father geniuses, which is sarcasm, to tell us that they're less than a human being, for sure. And nowhere in that document does it correct this math. And as a progressive and as a humanist, you should be offended by that. And we should be trying to promote a rewriting of that document that's based on science and evidence and skepticism and humanism, to demonstrate that Homo sapiens have a right to bodily autonomy, that we can demonstrate it with science, to describe what that demonstration is, and then to provide the multiple different scientific definitions of what a Homo sapiens is, so that when you're being dehumanized by a certain group of people, you can go in front of a judge and say, sir or ma'am, this person is trying to take away the rights of this other person, but we can demonstrate using science that they're Homo sapiens. And so they get all the rights that all Homo sapiens get per the Constitution of the United States of America. I'm going to leave you with that for today. Thank you for listening. If you like this content, please follow me on YouTube where I have other content. I have a show called Paul's Passive House where I'm retrofitting a 1950s house to the Passive House standard, which is the highest efficiency standard in the world. And I also have another show called Urbanist Snark, where I use my snarky attitude to critique urbanism and make pro-urbanist, pro-humanist suggestions. Thanks again for listening to the Hot Tub Monologues.